Henry Walker only meant to take a short drive with his old dog, Ranger, to visit a friend from long ago. But the moment his truck stopped in front of the abandoned farmhouse, standing alone in the frozen fields, he knew something wasn't right. The front door hung open, pushed back and forth by the wind. From inside, the sound of a child crying broke the silence. Ranger's ears snapped upright. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a warning before Henry had time to understand what he was hearing. It wasn't his old friend who stepped into the doorway. It was a woman he had never seen before, holding two small children close to her. Her eyes were red, her voice shaking. "Sir, do you know who owns this house?" she asked softly. We don't have anywhere else to go." They had been living in the shadows, trapped in the grip of winter. No electricity, no heat, no one who even knew they were there. And they had no idea that the man standing in front of them, with his loyal dog at his side, was the last person their friend had trusted with a secret they had never been told. Henry Walker thought he was just stopping by to see an old friend, but that cold night would pull him into a story he never saw coming. Winter in Amarillo came quietly. Snow lay in thin, uneven patches along rooftops, fences, and the edges of sidewalks, while the morning sun filtered through pale gray clouds, offering light without warmth. The air was dry and cold, steady rather than biting, the kind of cold that settled in and stayed. Henry Walker stepped out onto his porch and paused, taking in the stillness. At 69, he stood solid and balanced, shoulders square, movements unhurried. His hair was cut short and silver, his mustache neatly trimmed. Years of working with engines had left his hands broad and steady, his skin weathered but healthy. Time had softened him, not slowed him. At his side stood Ranger, a large German shepherd with a thick coat of black and tan fur. The dog's muzzle had begun to gray, and his eyes, deep brown and alert, followed Henry closely. Ranger was 12 years old, quiet by nature and observant. He rarely barked, preferring to watch and listen. When Henry took a step, Ranger matched it, tail swaying slowly behind him. The garage sat behind the house, a familiar extension of Henry's daily life. He lifted the metal door with a practiced motion, letting it roll upward as pale winter light spilled inside. The smell of oil, cold metal, and dry wood filled the space immediately. Ranger walked in ahead of him, circled once near the workbench, then lay down with his front paws stretched out, ears half raised. Henry switched on the old black radio resting on a shelf. A country song drifted through the quiet, soft, and unobtrusive. He opened the metal toolbox on the bench, intending to find a screwdriver to tighten a loose hinge on the back door. His fingers moved automatically, past sockets, bolts, and wrenches, until they stopped. He lifted a wooden-handled wrench, its grip darkened by years of use. The metal was worn but strong. The weight of it felt immediately familiar. Ranger raised his head, sensing the shift in Henry's posture. The wrench had belonged to Sam Whitmore, Henry's closest friend during his years in the military. Sam had been tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and short brown hair. He carried himself with confidence, but spoke plainly, without pretense. Sam was the kind of man who laughed easily and stepped forward when something needed doing. After leaving the service, Sam settled in another town, started a family, and bought a modest house. For years, he and Henry stayed in touch, first through letters, then emails. Over time, the messages came less often. Not because anything was wrong, life simply moved forward. Henry turned the wrench slowly in his hands. The wood was smooth, shaped by years of work. He remembered Sam handing it to him one afternoon, saying he'd get more use out of it. The memory didn't sting. It rested quietly, like a well-worn tool set aside but not forgotten. Henry sat down on the wooden stool by the bench. Ranger rose, stepped over, and rested his head against Henry's knee. A familiar gesture when his owner grew quiet. Henry reached down and ran his hand along Ranger's thick fur, feeling the warmth beneath the winter coat. "It's been a long time since I checked on Sam," Henry said softly, more to the room than to the dog. Ranger gave a low, contented sound and stayed close. Henry stood again and slipped the wrench into the pocket of his heavy brown coat. He shut off the radio, lowered the garage door, and stepped back into the cold. Snow crunched lightly under his boots as he walked around to the front of the house. His pickup truck waited at the curb, a deep blue vehicle with a few scratches along the side and a small dent near the rear bumper. It wasn't new, but it was well cared for. Ranger jumped up onto the passenger seat with ease, settling in and facing forward. Henry started the engine. It responded smoothly, the sound steady and reassuring. He backed out of the driveway and drove through the familiar streets of town. The small grocery store stood on the corner, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. The gas station sign flickered faintly. A diner down the road already had a few trucks parked out front. A couple of neighbors lifted their hands in greeting. Henry nodded back. Ranger watched through the window, ears lifting as faces passed by. Henry didn't check a map or make a call ahead. In places like Amarillo, it wasn't unusual to drive out to see an old friend after years of silence. People understood that time passed, and sometimes it looped back on itself without explanation. As he left town, the road opened into wide fields dusted with snow. The sunlight caught on the white ground, making it glow faintly. Henry cracked the window just enough to let the cold air drift in. It carried the smell of dry earth and winter grass. Ranger leaned slightly toward the window, breathing in the air before settling back. Henry thought about the last messages he and Sam exchanged. Short updates, unfinished plans, casual promises to meet someday. There was no regret in the memory, just the sense that something unfinished had gently asked for attention. This morning felt like the right moment. Henry kept the truck at a steady pace, hands relaxed on the wheel, the road stretching quietly ahead. Snow lingered in the fields, the sky pale above him. With Ranger beside him and an old wrench in his pocket, Henry followed the familiar road toward the town where Sam had once lived, simply to see if his friend was still there. The road narrowed as Henry drove farther from town. Snow lay thicker here, gathered along fence lines and low spots where the wind had pushed it. The sun was still out, pale and distant, casting light without warmth. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears lifting as the truck slowed. Henry turned onto the gravel drive he remembered. The house stood back from the road, a one-story place with weathered siding and a sagging porch roof. Snow had settled on the steps and along the railing. At first glance, it looked empty, quiet, the kind of house that had been left behind in a hurry. Henry parked near the edge of the drive and shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than before. Ranger hopped down and stood close to Henry's leg, scanning the yard. Henry didn't move right away. He stayed by the truck, taking the house in. The windows were dark, but not boarded. The porch light was off, but the bulb was there. Tire tracks crossed the drive, faint but recent, pressed into the snow. He felt it then. Not alarm, just awareness. Something here didn't match the idea of an abandoned place. Henry walked toward the porch, boots crunching softly. Ranger stayed half a step behind, calm but alert. The front door was closed, though not locked tight. A strip of fabric had been tucked along the bottom to keep the cold out. Henry stopped at the bottom step. He didn't knock right away. "Hello?" he called out, voice steady, not loud. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was movement inside, a soft shuffle, a pause. The door opened part way. A woman stood there, holding the edge of the door with one hand. She was in her early 30s, slim, a little taller than average. Her brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, strands escaping around her face. Her skin was pale from the cold, and her eyes were tired but clear. She wore a thick jacket that looked borrowed rather than chosen. She looked at Henry, then at Ranger, then back at Henry again. "Yes?" she said carefully. Henry kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed. "My name's Henry," he said. "I'm looking for a man named Sam Whitmore. This used to be his place." The woman's shoulders eased just slightly. She opened the door another inch. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Sam doesn't live here anymore." Henry nodded once. "I figured that might be the case." Ranger sat down beside him without being told. Sarah glanced at the dog, then back at Henry. "He's well behaved," she said. "He's old enough to know better," Henry replied. That earned a small smile. Cold air moved between them. Henry noticed the way Sarah shifted her weight, bracing against it. "I don't mean to intrude," Henry said. "I was just passing through." Sarah hesitated, then opened the door wider. Warm air slipped out, thin but noticeable. "You can step inside for a moment," she said. "It's cold out there." Henry didn't rush. "If that's all right, it is." Inside, the house was mostly bare. The furniture was mismatched, clearly gathered over time. A space heater hummed softly in the corner of the living room. Blankets were folded on the couch. A pair of small boots sat by the wall, damp from melted snow. Two children peeked around the corner. One was a boy around 7, thin, with dark hair and watchful eyes. The other was a girl, maybe 4, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. They stayed close to each other. "This is Ben," Sarah said quietly, nodding toward the boy. "And Lily." Henry bent slightly at the waist. "Nice to meet you," he said. "I'm Henry." The boy nodded. The girl stared at Ranger. "He won't bother you," Henry said gently. Ranger lowered himself to the floor, chin resting on his paws. Sarah exhaled just a little. "We've been staying here a few weeks," she said. "Sam was a friend of my husband's. He told us we could use the place for a while. Then he moved. We lost touch." Henry listened. He didn't interrupt. "We keep it clean," Sarah added, as if it mattered. "We don't take more than we need." "I'm sure," Henry said. He looked around, taking in the details without judgment. The heater worked, but barely. The windows were sealed with tape. The house held warmth the way a tired hand holds heat, briefly. "I don't own the place, understood, Henry said. "I just wanted to check on an old friend." Sarah nodded. "I understand." For a moment, no one spoke. Snow tapped lightly against the window. Henry glanced at Ranger, then back at Sarah. "I won't stay long," he said. "Just wanted to make sure I wasn't knocking on an empty house." "It's not empty," Sarah said quietly. Henry met her eyes. "I can see that." He stepped back toward the door. "Thank you for letting me in out of the cold." "You're welcome," Sarah said. Outside, the air felt sharper than before. Henry stood on the porch a moment, looking at the yard, the snow, the quiet road. Ranger waited beside him. Henry knew now that Sam was gone, and that something else had taken his place. Henry drove back as the afternoon slid toward evening. The sun stayed low, pale against the winter sky, and the snow along the fields caught what light there was. Ranger lay stretched across the passenger seat, eyes half closed, rising now and then when the truck slowed. Neither of them hurried. When Henry reached his street, the houses looked the same as always, quiet, familiar, steady. He pulled into his driveway, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel. Ranger lifted his head and waited. Inside, the house held the kind of warmth that came from being lived in, not from excess. Henry hung his coat by the door and set the old wrench on the small table beneath the window. Ranger went straight to his bowl, drank, then circled twice before settling onto his mat near the heater vent. Henry moved through the house at his own pace. He washed his hands, made coffee, even though it was late, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light fade from the snow outside. The street lamp flickered on. The quiet felt thicker at night, but not lonely, just still. In the garage, he turned on the overhead light and closed the door behind him. The space warmed slowly. He leaned against the workbench and looked at the tools he knew by memory. Nothing was out of place. Nothing needed fixing. He took the wrench from the table and set it on the bench, turning it once so the handle faced him. Sam's wrench. He hadn't planned on bringing it back out, but there it was. Henry thought about the house again, the way the cold pressed in, the heater working but barely, the way Sarah stood straight even when the draft hit her face, the kids staying quiet, watching. He didn't replay the scene in his head. He didn't try to solve it. He just let it sit there, the way you let an engine idle before deciding what gear to shift into. Ranger padded into the garage and sat nearby. His tail thumped once against the floor. "You tired?" Henry asked. Ranger looked up, then rested his chin back down. Henry smiled faintly and reached for a rag, wiping his hands even though they weren't dirty. The habit was older than he was willing to count. He moved to the shelf along the wall and checked the heater he kept there, an older but reliable unit he had used during a power outage years ago. He didn't plug it in, he didn't test it, he just looked at it, noting the cord, the switches, the casing. Then he stepped back. Supper was simple. Soup warmed on the stove, bread toasted lightly. Ranger ate, then lay down where he could see Henry without being in the way. The radio played low in the background, the same station Henry had listened to for years. Afterward, Henry washed the bowl, dried it, and set it upside down on the towel. He didn't rush through the motions. He never had. Later, he sat in his chair with the lamp on and the room dim around him. Outside, the snow reflected the streetlight. Ranger slept, one ear lifting now, and then Henry thought again about Sam, about how people moved on without making noise about it, about how places stayed, even when the people didn't. He didn't feel responsible for the house. He didn't feel like he'd been given a task, but he also didn't feel like he could forget what he'd seen. Before bed, Henry went back into the garage one more time. He opened the toolbox and placed the wrench back where it belonged. He paused, then took it out again and set it closer to the front of the bench. tomorrow," he said quietly. Ranger stood and followed him back inside. The night settled in. The heater hummed, snow rested where it had fallen, and Henry let the day end the way it had begun, without forcing anything, without looking too far ahead. Morning came clear and cold. The sky was pale blue, and the snow from the night before still clung to the edges of the street and the tops of fences. Henry loaded the truck without much thought. He moved the way he always did, slow, steady, sure of each step. He didn't bring much. A small box of basic groceries from the corner store, the old heater from the garage, wrapped in a blanket to keep it from rattling, a tool bag with a few things he knew by heart, nothing that made noise, nothing that asked for thanks. Ranger watched from the passenger seat as Henry closed the tailgate. His ears lifted when the engine started. They drove out the same road as before. Snow lay thin across the fields, broken by brown grass and fence posts. The set stayed low, bright but distant. Henry kept both hands on the wheel and let the road do the rest. The house came into view, quiet against the open land. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. The porch looked the same. Old boards, a light dusting of snow, the railing worn smooth by years of hands. Henry parked where he had the day before. He stood by the truck for a moment, looking, not checking, just taking it in. Ranger stepped down and stayed close. Henry picked up the box of groceries and walked to the porch. He knocked once, then waited. The door opened part way. Sarah stood there, her hair pulled back again, her jacket zipped to the chin. She looked surprised, then cautious, then calmer when she saw Henry. "Morning," Henry said. "Morning," she replied. "Is something wrong?" "No," Henry said. "I was passing through again." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "It's cold out there." "It is." Inside, the house felt colder than the day before. The heater hummed, but the air stayed thin. Ben sat at the table, working on something with a pencil. Lily knelt on the floor with her rabbit. Ranger stopped at the doorway and lay down, his head resting between his paws. Henry set the box on the counter. "Just some groceries," he said. "Nothing fancy." Sarah frowned slightly. "You didn't have to." "I know," Henry said. "You don't have to use them." She nodded once and let it go. Henry glanced toward the corner of the room. "Mind if I take a look at the heater?" Sarah looked relieved more than anything. "Please." He knelt beside it, checking the cord, the plug, the vent. He didn't rush. He didn't talk much. After a minute, he adjusted the setting and repositioned it away from the wall. "It'll do better like this," he said. "Still not great." "That's been about right," Sarah said. Henry went back outside and returned with the wrapped heater from his truck. He set it down carefully and unwrapped it. "This one's older," he said, "but it's steady." He plugged it in and waited. The fan kicked on. Warm air followed. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Henry nodded. "You can keep it here for now." He looked around once more, noticing small things, the tape on the windows, the way the door didn't quite seal at the bottom. "I can fix that," he said, more to himself than to her. Sarah smiled, tired but genuine. That would help. Henry didn't stay long. He didn't sit down. He didn't make plans. At the door, he paused. "I'll check in later," he said, "if that's all right." "It is," Sarah said. Outside, the cold felt sharper again. Henry loaded the empty blanket back into the truck. Ranger jumped up and settled in. As they drove away, but Henry didn't look back. He didn't think of what he'd done as helping. It felt more like tightening a loose bolt, something small that kept things from rattling too much. The next morning felt colder, the kind of cold that settled into the corners of a house and stayed there. Henry noticed it as soon as he stepped out of his truck. The snow had hardened overnight, crunching louder under his boots. Ranger jumped down and shook himself once, then waited. Henry hadn't brought much again. A small tool bag, a roll of weather stripping, a tube of clear sealant, things he'd used his whole life without thinking about them. He knocked once. Sarah opened the door with a look that said she'd been awake for a while. Her hair was pulled back, a little neater today. She looked tired, but steadier. "Morning," Henry said. "Morning," she replied. "Come in." The house felt warmer than before, though drafts still moved along the floor. The old heater Henry had brought was running steady in the corner. Ben sat at the table, working quietly. Lily sat nearby, lining up small plastic figures on the floor. Ranger came in and settled near the doorway. Henry set the tool bag down. "Mind if I take a look around?" Sarah shook her head. "Go ahead." Henry moved slowly, checking the door first. He knelt and ran his hand along the bottom edge, feeling the cold air slip through. "That's where you're losing it," he said. He worked without talking much, measured, cut the strip, pressed it into place. The door closed tighter afterward, the latch sounding firmer. Ben watched from the table. "You fix cars?" the boy asked. "Du bist damit CDs." "Used to," Henry said. Ben nodded. "My dad fixed things." Henry looked up. "That's a good skill." Ben went back to his work. Henry moved to the windows next. He checked the tape, added sealant where it had cracked, smoothed it with his thumb. The house quieted as the drafts faded. Not warm, just better. Sarah stood off to the side, arms crossed, not in the way. "You don't have to do all this," she said. Henry shrugged. "I know." He didn't explain further. Lily crawled closer, the rabbit dragging along the floor. She watched Henry's hands. "What's that?" she asked. "Sealant," Henry said. "Keeps the cold out." She nodded like that made sense. Ranger lifted his head when Lily passed near him, then rested it back down. Henry worked his way through the house without hurry, tightened a loose hinge, fixed a rattle in the vent cover, adjusted the heater cord so it didn't bend sharply. Each small fix made the house feel less tired. When he finished, he stood and stretched his back once. "That should help for now." Sarah exhaled. "It already does." Henry wiped his hands with a rag and packed his tools. "I'll check back," he said. "If something comes loose." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Henry paused at the door. "I don't know where Sam ended up," he said, "but I'll see what I can find out." She didn't ask how. "Thank you." Outside, the wind had picked up. Henry loaded the tool bag into the truck. Ranger hopped in. As they pulled away, the house looked the same as before, but Henry knew better. Henry woke before sunrise. Snow still clung to the edges of the street, and the sky held that flat winter gray that promised cold without drama. He made coffee, fed Ranger, and sat at the small kitchen table with the mug warming his hands. He didn't rush. He didn't plan a speech. He just made a short list on a scrap of paper. Names, places, a couple of phone numbers he knew by memory. After breakfast, Henry pulled on his coat and headed out. Ranger stayed behind this time, watching from the doorway. Henry gave him a pat on the head. "I'll be back." The town office opened early. The clerk behind the counter recognized Henry right away. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Henry replied. "I've got a question." He kept it simple. Asked about temporary housing options. Warming centers. Any programs for families who needed a place for a few weeks, not forever. She nodded, pulled out a folder, and pointed him in the right direction. No judgment, no rush. From there, Henry walked across the street to the library. He sat at one of the computers and searched quietly. Local listings, community boards. A church a few miles out that ran a small shelter during winter storms. A nonprofit that helped with short-term rentals. He wrote things down, nothing fancy. By late morning, he drove back toward the old house. The snow along the road had softened, and water ran thin along the ditches. Sarah answered the door with a guarded look that eased when she saw Henry. "I won't stay long," he said. "Just wanted to share a few things." Inside, the house felt steadier than before. Warmer. The kids were at the table, working quietly. Ranger wasn't with him, and the room felt a little emptier without the dog's calm weight. Henry set a folded paper on the counter. "There are a few places in town," he said. "Nothing permanent, but safe, warm." Sarah read, her face still. "I didn't ask you to." "I know," Henry said. "You don't have to take any of it." She looked up. "Thank you." Henry didn't push. He pointed to one line. "This one's run by folks who don't ask too many questions. Short stays." Sarah nodded. "That helps." They stood there a moment, the quiet stretching but not straining. Henry glanced toward the back room. "Kids doing all right?" "As much as can be expected," Sarah said. Henry nodded. "That's usually enough." He left soon after. No promises, no deadlines. That afternoon, Henry made one more stop. The hardware store. He picked up a few small things and nodded to the owner, a man he'd known for years. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Back home, Henry sat in the garage with the door halfway open, letting in the cold light. He sorted through old papers until he found Sam's last known address. He stared at it a moment, then picked up the phone. The call didn't go far. The number was disconnected. Henry hung up, not surprised. He tried another contact, left a short message, no details. When evening came, he made dinner and sat with Ranger at his feet. The day had been full in a quiet way. No heavy lifting, no fixing, just moving a few things into place. Later, the phone rang. Henry answered. "Henry, Mr. Walker?" It was the clerk from the town office. "I found something you might want to know." She gave him an address, a short-term rental, affordable, available next week. "Appreciate it," Henry said. He wrote it down, set the paper beside the others. He didn't call Sarah that night. He didn't want to rush her. Before bed, Henry stood at the window. Snow reflected the streetlight. Ranger slept behind him. "Tomorrow," Henry said quietly. The snow eased overnight. By morning, the road looked wet instead of white, and the air felt a little lighter. Henry parked by the old house just after 9. Ranger stayed in the truck this time, watching through the window. Sarah opened the door before Henry knocked. She looked more rested than she had earlier in the week. Her coat was on, keys in hand. "We heard back," she said. "The place you mentioned, it's available?" Henry nodded. "Good." She didn't sound excited, just steady. That felt right. Inside, the house was quieter than usual. A couple of boxes sat near the wall. Ben was folding clothes at the table. Lily had her rabbit tucked under one arm and was sorting small things into a paper bag. Henry set his hands on his hips and looked around. "You've got to start," Sarah smiled faintly, "trying not to take too much." "That's usually the trick," Henry said. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give instructions. He set his tool bag down and went to the back door. The seal he had put in earlier held. The heater hummed. "Truck's out front," he said. "If you want help with the heavy stuff." Sarah paused, then nodded. That would help. They moved in small steps, a box at a time, a chair, a folded blanket. Henry lifted without strain and carried things carefully. Ben helped where he could. Lily followed with her bag, stopping now and then to check on Ranger through the window. At one point, Sarah stopped near the doorway and looked back into the house. She didn't say anything. Henry waited. "Sam told us to treat it like a place you borrow," she said finally. "Leave it better than you found it." Henry nodded. He'd say that. They worked quietly. The house emptied slowly, not all at once. When they finished, Henry walked through the rooms one last time, checking doors and windows, turning off lights. Outside, the truck bed held only what was needed, nothing extra. Sarah locked the door and stood there, keys in her hand. She didn't linger. The drive to the new place was short, a small unit on a side street, clean and plain. Snow had been shoveled. The steps were dry. Henry parked it and helped unload. Inside, the heater was already running. The rooms felt tight but warm. Ben chose a corner for his things. Lily set her rabbit on the bed and climbed up beside it. Sarah leaned against the counter. "I don't know how to say this without—" "You don't have to," Henry said. She nodded. "Still, thank you." Henry looked around once more. "I'll bring the heater back tomorrow," he said. "Only if you need it," she replied. "I'll manage." Outside, Henry stood by the truck and looked up and down the street. Ranger barked once, then settled. Henry tipped his hat. "Take care." "You too," Sarah said. As Henry drove away, he felt the same quiet he always did when a job was done. Not pride, not relief. Just a sense that things were set where they needed to be, for now. At home, he put the empty tool bag back on the shelf and poured himself a cup of coffee. Ranger lay nearby, head on his paws. "Almost there," Henry said, more to himself than to the dog. Sunday morning came clear and cold. Snow still rested in the shaded places, though the sun had begun to soften the edges. Henry stood on his porch with a mug of coffee, Ranger sitting at his feet. The town was quiet in the way it often was on Sundays. No rush, no need to be anywhere fast. Henry wasn't much for big routines on Sundays. Sometimes he went to church, sometimes he didn't. Today, he stayed home. He liked the quiet. After breakfast, he walked into the garage and opened the door, just enough to let the light in. The tools sat where they always had. The bench was clear. He checked the heater once more, unplugged it, and leaned it against the wall. It would stay there, ready, like most things in his life. Ranger lay down nearby, eyes half open. Henry thought about the week, not in pieces, but as a whole. The drive, the house, the cold, the small things that had needed fixing. He didn't replay conversations. He didn't wonder what he could have done differently. He trusted the shape things had taken. Around mid-morning, Henry drove into town. He parked near the small church on the corner, not to go in, just to sit for a moment. People were arriving, greeting one another quietly. The bell rang once. Henry stayed in the truck. He rested his hands on the wheel and watched. He'd learned long ago that faith didn't always come from sitting in a pew. Sometimes it came from paying attention. He thought of something his mother used to say when things didn't make sense. Do what's right in front of you. God will handle the rest. It wasn't a lesson, just a way of living. Henry drove home. In the afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice sounded steadier than before. "We're settled in," she said. "The kids are warm." "I'm glad," Henry replied. "I wanted you to know," she said. "We'll be okay." Henry smiled. "That's good to hear." They didn't talk long. They didn't need to. That evening, Henry made a simple dinner and ate at the table with Ranger nearby. The sun dropped low, turning the snow outside a soft gold before it faded to gray. Henry washed his plate and set it to dry. Later, he sat in his chair with the lamp on and the room quiet. Ranger slept at his feet, breathing slow and even. Henry didn't think of himself as someone who had done much. He hadn't changed the world. He hadn't fixed everything. He had only answered what came to his door and done what he knew how to do. He thought about how life worked sometimes, how paths crossed without warning, how a person could set out to check on an old friend and end up doing something else entirely. Not because it was planned, but because it was placed there. Henry folded his hands loosely and looked toward the window. Outside, snow reflected the streetlight, steady and calm. He didn't say a prayer out loud. He didn't need to. He trusted that God heard the quiet ones just fine, the ones spoken in thought, the ones made of action instead of words. "Thank you for letting me be useful," he thought, "and for knowing when enough is enough." Before bed, Henry stepped back into the garage one last time. He shut off the light and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Ranger waited at the door. Henry closed it behind them and turned off the last lamp. The night settled in, gentle and complete. Somewhere along the way, Henry realized he felt lighter. Not because he expected anything in return, but because he trusted that the work he'd done, small as it was, had been enough. And that, he believed, was often how God worked best.